Yeah, she's really coming together, but we still got work to do. Let's get into this. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and thanks so much for tuning in. Today, we're continuing with the build of my Team Associated RC10 B6.3 two-wheel drive off-road racing buggy. Now, this is the fourth video in the build series of my B6.3, so if you want to check out the previous video, I'll post a link in the cards in the top corner and I'll leave a link in the description below. In this video, we're going to be focusing on parts bags 7 and 8 in an effort to keep this a bit on the shorter side while including enough detail to make it useful. And as in previous videos, I'll add time markers in the description so you can reference or rewatch specific parts of the build video without having to scrub through the entire thing. And as always, if you want to follow along with this build series, make sure to hit that subscribe button and the little bell icon to get notifications whenever I upload the next video. Now, before I get into the build, I do want to mention one thing I've done to this buggy since posting the last build video, and that is the installation of the rear anti-roll bar end links onto the lower rear suspension A-arms here and here. Now, this was a relatively straightforward process using a pair of needle nose pliers to get into the tight space and snapping the two end links into place. Now, I figured this was a fairly straightforward and easy thing for any of you to figure out, so I didn't really cover it in the last video. All right, so now that that's out of the way, let's start this build by getting into parts bag 7. All right, so we've now emptied out the contents of parts bag 7, and as is typical practice, I put all of the plastic parts in this bin over here, put all of the metal components in this bin over here, and all of our fasteners in this bin over here. Now, before we actually get into parts bag 7, we're not going to be using the chassis anytime soon, so I'll just get this thing out of the way. Let's get started with step number 1. All right, so step 1 has us assembling the rear suspension hubs. Now, much like when we built the front suspension hubs, the instructions here show only one side. However, it does state very clearly that we're to build two sides, both a left and a right. So we're gonna do exactly that. So let's get started by gathering all the parts we're gonna need for this first step, starting with 2 heavy-duty 6mm ball studs, which are here and here. Next, we're going to need 6 5.5 by 2mm blue ball stud washers. That is 3 on one side and 3 on the other. Those are all right here. Those are the 6 blue anodized washers. Next, we're going to need our rear hub link mounts, which are these 2 black alloy pieces here and here. And we're also going to need the rear hubs themselves, which are on this sprue right here. Let's get these off the sprue right now. And those are the rear plastic hubs. We're also going to need 2, that is to say 4, 2 per side, M3 by 12mm button head cap screws. There. And we're also going to need 2 rear hub inserts. Now, much like with the front suspension, there are a few inserts that are included with the kit. These are the inserts themselves. The kit includes what looks like plus and minus 3mm, plus and minus 2mm, plus and minus 1mm, and 0. So the actual instructions call for the plus 3mm. So let's get those off of here right now. Those are these 2 inserts here and here. And the other thing we're going to need is some thread lock. So of course we get back my trusty piece of plastic that I use and our thread lock right here. All right, so let's get started by assembling the rear hub link mounts. Okay, so the rear hub link mounts are now finished, just so that you guys are clear as far as the orientation is concerned. So when you look at the actual rear hub link mounts themselves, the 2 ears here and here, they should be downward, and the ball stud itself should actually be sort of on the flat surface. All right. Next, we'll start the assembly of the actual hubs themselves. All right, so those are the hubs pretty much completely assembled. The only thing we have left to do is to put in the inserts, so let's do that right now. So the inserts themselves, as I said, these are supposed to be 3 up. That is to say, a positive 3mm is the kit setup, which means that this little tab right here should be facing down when installed in the rear hub itself. So let's do that. Just goes in like this. I hope you guys can see that, but there it is. Do that on the next one. And by the way, you'll also notice these inserts will only go in one way. So on this one side, it's a bit bigger, the hole it is, and on this side, the hole is way too small to accept the insert. So this now goes in like that. And as I said, the tab is facing down. That now is the rear hubs completely assembled. And that brings us to the end of step 1. Let's move on to step number 2. All right, so the first part of step 2 has us building the CVA drive shafts. Now, much like the last step where we were only shown one side and told to build both sides, it's the same here as well. We're only shown one side, but very clearly instructed to build 2 sides, which is what we're gonna do. Now, before we get into this, first thing I'm gonna do is actually lay down a microfiber towel where we're gonna put all of our parts on. The reason why is CVA drive shafts combine 2 things that nobody likes, and that is it involves grease and it involves small parts. So we're going to talk more about the grease in just a bit, but because we're talking about small parts, I'm going to put them on this microfiber towel. So let's get our parts together and get started on this. First thing we're going to need are these CVA bones. These are 69mm CVA bones, and they are right here. The next thing we're going to need are our CVA couplers. There's 2 of those, and here they are. Next thing we're going to need are our CVA axles. Again, 2 of those. And they're right there. And we're also going to need our CVA pins, which are right here. Now, the instructions also call for the use of black grease. Now, if you guys recall from my previous video, you guys know that I'm not using the kit supplied black grease, and instead I'm using the RM2 heavy metal grease from J Concepts. And I've loaded this black grease into a syringe with a small tip, which makes it very easy to apply. Now, this is another reason why I use this method, as you guys will see when we get into the assembly. So let's get into that right now. Now, the instructions state to put black grease onto the coupler itself. I'm not going to do that at this stage. I'm going to go ahead and actually assemble the axles themselves, and then I'm going to go back in later and put the black grease in using the syringe. So let's get into that. Okay, so that is the first CVA drive shaft completely assembled. Let's get on to assembling the second one. Now, when you do assemble these, when you insert the coupler, ensure that the hole is lined up with the slot that's in the CVA bone itself. I'm hoping that you guys can see that on camera, but make sure that that hole is lined up with the slot. Set that aside for just a second. Insert the pin in one of the holes in the drive axles, but don't go all the way, obviously, just insert it a bit. Then put the axle in place and slowly push the pin in until you find the hole in the coupler. Okay. So that there is now the 2 CVA drive shafts completely assembled. Now, what I'll do, as I said, is use the syringe to apply grease on the inside of the axle cup. Move it around to get that grease all inside the axle cup itself, and it should be good. I'll do the same with the second one. And that's that. So the two CVA drive axles are now completed. Let's move on to the second part of step number 2. Now, the second part of step number 2 has us installing bearings into the rear hubs, which we assembled in the previous step. So first thing we're going to need are two 5x12 by 4mm bearings, which are these two right here. And they'll be on the outboard side of each hub. And we're also going to need two 10x15 by 4mm bearings, these two right here, and these will actually be inserted on the inboard side of each of the two hubs. So let's go ahead and do that right now. All right, so second part of step 2 is now complete. We have bearings installed inside each of the rear hubs, and they're just press fit. One thing I do want to make note of is that the bearings that are included in the kit are sealed bearings, but they have a rubber seal on one side and a steel seal on the other side. Now, I don't know how critical this is, but many racers feel that the rubber side seals better than the steel side, and they tend to prefer the rubber side to be facing where there may be the most exposure to dirt. So that's how I've installed mine. You'll see the blue seal is on the outboard side here, and the blue seal is also facing the sort of most exposed side on the rear hub as well. So that's the rear hubs now basically complete. And then of course, each of the axles gets slid through each of the hubs like that. And that now completes the assembly of the rear axles to the rear hubs themselves. And that brings us to the end of step 2. Let's move on to step number 3. All right, on to step number 3. Now, the first part of step number 3 has us installing the wheel hexes, that is to say, these are clamping wheel hexes, 5mm offset, onto the rear axle and rear hub assemblies that we just finished in the previous step. So let's gather our parts together. First thing we're going to need are a couple of wheel hex pins. These are these two parts right here. We're also going to need the two clamping wheel hexes themselves. These two blue anodized alloy pieces. This is what they look like from one side, and this is what they look like on the back. You'll notice the slot for locating the pin. And we're also going to need an M1.6 by 5mm socket head cap screw. There's two of those, one per side. Those little guys right there, these are really quite small. Now that we have everything, let's go ahead and put the wheel hexes onto our drive shaft and hub assemblies right now. Okay, so the rear wheel hex clamps are now fully installed on our rear hub and drive shaft assemblies. The one thing I do want to mention when it comes to bolting down these socket head cap screws on either one of the wheel hex clamps, do not over tighten them. This is stated in the instructions, but I thought I would just let you guys know. They just need to be tight enough so that the wheel clamps themselves are clamped down on those pins. So now let's move on to the second part of step number 3. And in order to do that, we got to pull the chassis back in. So let me clear up a little bit and make some room. All right, so now that we've got the chassis back in place so we can work on it, the second part of step 3 calls for the installation of the rear hub and drive shaft assemblies we've just finished off onto the chassis itself using two rear hub hinge pins, which are here and here. Here's our two rear hub hinge pins, one on either side. We're also going to need two M3 lock nuts, these two guys. And we're also going to need rear hub spacers. We're going to need 2 of those per side. Those are on this sprue right here. This is the same sprue that had the hub inserts. So we're going to need these 4 right here. Let's get them off the sprue right now. All right, and those are the 4. These are just plastic inserts, 2 on one side, 2 on the other. All right, so now before we go ahead and actually install our rear hub assembly, the one thing I do want to make note of, let you guys know, and again, this is mentioned in the instructions, but I didn't mention it during the assembly. However, you'll notice on the rear hubs themselves, there is a demarcation that notes which side is which. This is the right-hand side. Obviously, the other one will have an L for the left-hand side. This is important when you go ahead and actually install the hubs onto the vehicle itself. So this one here being the right side, it's obviously going to go on this side. That will go on the other side. So let's go ahead and actually install our drive shaft and hub assemblies onto the chassis itself. Okay, so the rear hubs and drive axles are now installed onto the chassis. Now, they're a little bit difficult to see because there's not a heck of a lot holding these guys in place, but there they are. Now, the one thing I do want to mention when you do go ahead and install your own, the hint pins that go in here and here, they slide into the A-arms really rather easy, but once you get into the rear hub itself, they do tend to get a bit tight, which according to the manual is actually quite normal. So expect that you will have to put a little bit of force in order to get them to go into the rear hubs and make their way out. Of course, I think you guys saw me using tweezers to sort of hold the spacers, that is to say, the spacers that are right here. They're on the forward side of the rear hub. So if you have tweezers, I would highly suggest that you do that as well. And that now brings us to the end of step 3 and the end of bag 7. Let's get on to bag number 8. All right, so I've gone ahead and emptied out the contents of bag number 8. And as has been our practice, I've put the plastic parts in this bin over here. I've put all of our metal components in this bin over here, and bag 8 actually doesn't have any fasteners, so this bin is now empty. All right, so let's go ahead and get into step number 1. Okay, now before we actually get into step 1, I did want to make mention that bag 8 pretty much focuses on the assembly and installation of all the various turnbuckles that are used on the B6.3. So fair warning, the next few steps in the build process are going to be a little bit repetitive. So to start, step 1 has us building the steering turnbuckles. Now, much like in previous steps, we're only shown one side, but there's a very clear note here telling us that we're supposed to build both a left and a right side. So let's get started. First things first, let's grab ourselves a turnbuckle. Now they're all the same, so we're going to need 2 of those. This is a 3x48mm turnbuckle right there. Next, we're going to need ball cups. Now, in this case, we're going to need 4 of them, 2 per turnbuckle, and they are on this sprue right here. Now, I do want to bring note to the fact that these 2 turnbuckles on the end here, they are different than the rest of these. These are the ones that we're going to be using for bag 8. So let's grab 4 of the turnbuckles off of this sprue right now. All right, so we have our turnbuckles, we have our ball cups. Now we're ready to go ahead and assemble. Now, the one thing I do want to mention, and this is noted in the instructions, I'm really hoping you guys can see this on camera, but the turnbuckles themselves have a small mark on one side. It's like a line. The instructions tell you to put that line on the left side of the vehicle. That way, when you adjust the turnbuckles, you'll turn them all the same way and they'll open and close as needed. So keep that in mind. The next thing that I wanted to mention is that it's a good idea to use black grease on the inner threads of the ball cups themselves, which will make it much easier to thread the turnbuckles in. Now, as before, I'm going to be using the black grease that I have in my syringe. So let's get on to assembling the steering turnbuckles. There is another build tip that I did receive from a YouTuber who suggested that I give this a try when assembling turnbuckles. Now, this method is called the hoop method, and it was given to me by Roach RC. Now, before I try his technique, if you haven't already checked out Roach RC's channel, I'll leave a link in the description down below, but you should certainly check out his channel and check out his content. His content is fantastic, and I would highly encourage you to subscribe as well. However, his technique, or the technique that he described to me, is to use your hex driver and put it through the ball cup hole and then use it to turn the ball cup onto the turnbuckle itself. So, that actually worked extremely well. So, you know what? I'm going to continue using this method. Thank you very much, Roach RC, for that suggestion. Let's finish building these turnbuckles. Okay, so the front steering turnbuckles are now complete. Let's go ahead and get these installed. All right, so the front steering turnbuckles are now installed. One thing I didn't mention was that I did have to maintain a gap between the two ball cups. According to the instructions, these are supposed to be 27.7 millimeters. So when you're assembling your own, make sure you've got yourself a good vernier caliper. So that now brings us to the end of step one. Let's move on to step number two. Okay, so step two has us assembling the turnbuckle for the front upper suspension arm, which is going to be done pretty much exactly the same as the last step. So let's go ahead and get right into it. First thing, we're going to need 2 of our turnbuckles, and we're going to need 4 more ball cups. All right, and now we assemble these, much like we assembled the last ones. The only difference is the distance between the ball cups in this case is going to be 26.9 millimeters according to the instructions. So let's get on to it. Okay, so the two front upper suspension turnbuckles are now complete and ready to be installed. So let's do that right now. Okay, so the front upper suspension turnbuckles are now installed. That brings us to the end of step 2. Let's move on to step number 3. All right, so step 3 calls for us to build the last set of turnbuckles for the rear upper suspension. And much like the previous ones, it's exactly the same process. The only difference is the distance between the ball cups is now 25.5 millimeters. So let's get into this. First, we're gonna need our 2 turnbuckles, and we're also going to need 4 more ball cups. So let's get these off the sprue again. Just like the last time, these are the 4 ball cups. So now that we have everything we need, let's go ahead and build these turnbuckles. Okay, so The final set of turnbuckles for the rear upper suspension are now complete. Let's get these installed right now. Okay, so the rear turnbuckles are now installed. And that brings us to the end of Bag 8, Step 3, and the end of this build video. If you found any of this useful or even mildly entertaining, smash that like button. And if you want to follow along with the rest of this build series, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Thanks very much for watching, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.